The sun was bleeding itself out across the prairie when Clara Whitfield stepped out of her cabin. The land held the silence of something vast and half-forgotten, the kind of silence that pressed on a widow's chest until she felt her own breath was too loud. She stood there, apron dusted with flour, eyes turned toward the horizon where the sky smoldered into rust and violet. Her horse, Ashfall, was tied to the post beside the barn. He flicked his tail lazily, head bowed as if he, too, carried grief. Ashfall was more than a horse. He was her last thread of survival. Without him there would be no plow pulled, no firewood dragged home, no trips into town when winter set in. He was all she had left, and some nights she whispered to him as though he were the husband she had buried 2 winters past, or the child taken from her arms before he had even learned to walk. The prairie wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest sound, a groan, low and ragged. Clara turned, brows drawn, her hand instinctively tightening on the lantern handle. She thought at first it was some coyote caught in its dying breath, but as she stepped toward the fence line, she saw him. A young Apache man lay collapsed in the dirt, one arm curled beneath him, his chest rising shallowly. His skin glistened with fever sweat, his shirt torn and clotted dark with blood. The sight struck her heart with both fear and pity. Her neighbors would call him enemy, no more worthy of mercy than a rattlesnake. Elias Boone, the rancher 3 miles down, often spat his judgment like tobacco juice. You let one of them under your roof, Clara, you'll be marked same as them. The town needed no excuse to speak ill of her. Widows without men to guard them were already treated as creatures half gone astray. Clara stood over the Apache, lantern light trembling against his broken form. She should have turned away, should have left him to the dirt and coyotes. But she couldn't. His lips were cracked, his breath shallow, his face the kind of young that hadn't yet lived enough years to deserve dying. She knelt beside him. His eyes fluttered open, dark and sharp even through the fever's haze. For an instant she saw pride there, as if he wanted to rise and refuse her help. Then it faltered, and she saw what was truer. He was dying. She brought water to his lips, slow and careful. He drank like one afraid it would vanish, then coughed, eyes closing again. Clara pressed a cloth to his wound, whispering without meaning to, as though he were her child in fever, "Hush now, hush." When the lantern's flame began to burn low, she realized the truth. If he stayed here, he would die before the stars finished their circle. He needed his people, their medicine grounds, their chants and herbs she did not know. He would not make it walking. He would need a horse. Her gaze turned to Ashfall. The thought chilled her to the bone. Without Ashfall, she had no way to haul water, no way to survive the coming cold. The neighbors would call her mad. Even she could not fathom how she would manage. The horse was all she had left, the last thing tethering her to life on this unforgiving land. She sat long by the fire that night, the Apache breathing faintly on the cot she had dragged inside, the wind rattling the shutters. Her fingers moved over her lap, without purpose. The choice gnawed at her. Give and be undone. Refuse and watch a boy's last breath curl into the rafters. By the time the fire was no more than coals, she knew what she would do. Clara rose, wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders. She helped him stand, though he swayed, his weight heavy against her arm. She led him to the barn where Ashfall waited, stamping as though restless in the shadows. The Apache tried to protest, his voice cracked and low, words she did not understand. But when she pressed the reins into his trembling hands, he closed his eyes, as if receiving something too large for speech. "Go," Clara whispered, though her throat tightened on the word. "Find your way back." His hand brushed hers as he mounted, brief, unplanned, yet carrying a heat that lingered even after he pulled away. He urged Ashfall forward, and the horse obeyed, carrying him into the violet dusk. Clara stood there, watching until horse and rider blurred into the horizon's shadow. Then she was alone again, alone in a silence so deep it felt as if the land itself had swallowed her. The barn creaked. The prairie wind bent the grass. In her chest was a hollow ache where survival used to be. But beneath that ache, something flickered. A small, stubborn ember of knowing she had not let a soul die on her doorstep. And that, she told herself, would have to be enough. The nights were longer without Ashfall. Clara Whitfield felt it in her bones first, the way her steps dragged heavier across the dirt yard, the way her shoulders bowed under the weight of a water bucket she used to balance with ease. The horse had been her strength, her rhythm, her partner in survival. Without him, every task seemed carved from stone. On the second morning, she rose before the sun as always, but the silence rang differently. There was no soft snort from the barn, no nicker of greeting, only the groan of the windmill and the sharp bite of frost on her breath. Clara carried the wood herself, one arm trembling against the strain, her skirt hem catching in the mud. By evening, she baked bread, kneading the dough with slow, deliberate motions. Her hands worked until they ached, until the sticky flour reminded her she was still alive, still able to shape something from almost nothing. She set the loaf on the shelf and watched it rise, the yeasty warmth filling the cabin, but the smell seemed to mock her. Bread without anyone to share it was like laughter in an empty room. Word of her act reached town before the week was out. Elias Boone arrived at her fence line, boots dusty, hat pushed back, his eyes sharp with the satisfaction of a man who believed he knew better. "Clara," he drawled, leaning on the post, "heard tell you gave your only horse to some half-dead Apache. That true?" She did not answer at once, only lifted her chin and met his gaze. Silence was its own answer. Elias spat into the dirt, shaking his head. "That horse was your lifeline. And for what? Folks like him don't give back. You'll see. All you'll get in return is hunger." He tipped his hat and walked off, leaving her with the bitter taste of his words. She stood at the fence long after he disappeared, her hand pressed to the wood, steadying herself against the tremor inside. The whispers grew sharper after that. In the mercantile, women with aprons dusted in flour leaned close, their words barely hushed. Reckless, that one. Kind to the wrong sort of people. Men on the porch of a saloon shook their heads, muttering about foolish widows who didn't understand the cost of mercy. Clara bore it quietly. She had learned long ago that arguing only fanned the flames. Instead, she carried her silence like armor. Yet when she returned home, the silence became a weight of its own. At night, she would sit by the fire, her shawl drawn close, and hear the ghost of hoofbeats in the wind. Sometimes she closed her eyes and imagined Ashfall returning, his mane glinting silver in the moonlight, the Apache upright and strong in the saddle. Other nights, darker nights, she imagined Ashfall stumbling somewhere far away, bones picked by vultures, and her gift wasted. The doubt gnawed at her. Had she been foolish? Had her mercy been nothing more than desperation dressed up as kindness? Yet, even as she questioned, she remembered the way his hand had brushed hers before he left. That fleeting touch had carried something she could not name, an ember of trust, of recognition, of life refusing to surrender. It was that memory she clung to when her body bent under the weight of water pails, when her back ached from chopping wood alone. Winter teased the horizon early that year. The prairie grasses thinned, the sky turned harder, colder. Clara gathered sticks and logs until her palms blistered, until her arms shook from exhaustion. Each load she dragged back felt heavier than the last. One evening, after stacking the final bundle by the door, she sank onto the stoop, breath ragged. The world stretched out before her, an ocean of dry grass swaying beneath a steel-gray sky. The wind hissed across it like a warning. She pressed her hands together, fingers stiff with cold. "If nothing comes back," she whispered to the empty land, "let me at least keep the memory of giving." Her words were stolen by the wind, scattered into the vastness. But saying them out loud steadied her, as though the prairie itself bore witness to her vow. Inside, she set her bread on the table and ate in silence. Each bite was heavy, but she chewed slowly, reverently, as though she were partaking in more than food, partaking in endurance, in proof that she still lived despite the odds. That night, the loneliness pressed hard against her chest. She lay in bed, staring at the rafters, listening to the fire pop and fade. The shadows deepened, and the house seemed too large for one woman's heart. She thought of Elias Boone's words, the town's judgment, the endless tasks that lay ahead without Ashfall. Yet just as her eyes began to sting with unshed tears, she remembered again the Apache's face, the fevered sheen, the stubborn pride, the flicker of hope when she pressed the reins into his hand. She replayed that moment over and over, like a song that kept her alive. The night wore on. Silence stretched across the prairie, vast and eternal. Clara whispered into it, not to anyone in particular, but to the land, the stars, perhaps even to herself. Come back. Just come back. And the silence answered with nothing but wind. The night had been long, so long Clara thought it might never break. The fire had burned itself to ash, the cold had crept into the corners of her cabin, and her dreams were restless things, full of hoofbeats that vanished when she reached for them. Just before dawn, a sound woke her. It was faint at first, so soft she thought her mind had conjured it. The low, thunderous drumming of hooves on frozen earth. Clara sat up, heart hammering. For weeks she had dreamed of this sound, only to open her eyes to silence. But this time, the walls trembled. The sound grew louder, filling the prairie with a pulse as steady as her own heartbeat. She pulled her shawl tight and stepped barefoot into the cold. The air was sharp, the sky split with the pale edge of dawn. Across the horizon, shadows moved, shadows that multiplied, spilled, spread. A herd. Wild mustangs, their manes tossing fire as the rising sun caught them. Dozens of them, maybe more, galloping like a living storm. And at their front, riding astride her Ashfall, was the figure she had almost convinced herself she'd never see again.
Taza.
He sat upright, his wounds bound, his body no longer frail but steady as stone. The fevered boy she had given her horse to was gone. In his place was a rider who belonged to the dawn, who carried the wild strength of the herd behind him. The mustangs circled near her yard, their breath rising in clouds, their hooves striking sparks against the stones. Clara stood rooted to the earth, her hands pressed to her mouth, unable to speak. Taza drew Ashfall to a halt before her. For a moment neither moved. His eyes, dark and steady, held hers. The silence between them was not the silence of judgment or loneliness, but something heavier, richer, an unspoken language of survival, gratitude, and kinship. Without a word, he gestured to the herd behind him. It was not a trade, not repayment in the way men kept their ledgers. It was something greater, abundance born for mercy. She had given her only horse. Now, at dawn, the prairie had returned a river of horses, wild and free. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for Ashfall's mane, feeling the familiar warmth beneath her palm. The tears came unbidden, hot and stinging, rolling down her weathered cheeks. She whispered, voice breaking, "You came back." Taza dismounted. The moment his boots touched the earth, she saw the slight wince of pain he tried to hide. He was still healing. But even so, he moved with quiet dignity, as if standing on ground made sacred by her sacrifice. They did not speak much. No words could stretch far enough to hold what hung between them. Instead, their gestures filled the silence. The way he placed a hand lightly over his chest before bowing his head. The way she lowered her gaze in return, the tears falling onto the frost-bitten soil. From the ridge behind her cabin, Elias Boone watched with two other townsfolk. Clara saw them there, saw the disbelief on their faces as the herd shimmered in the dawn light. Their whispers, their pity, their scorn, all of it fell away into silence. Judgment had no footing here. For the first time in months, Clara did not care what they saw. She did not need their approval. She had lived through hunger, through shame, through endless nights of doubt, and now the proof of her choice thundered before her. Mercy multiplied. The herd stilled, restless yet contained, their bodies steaming in the chill. Taza turned his eyes toward her again. He did not linger long. He was not hers to keep, nor she his. Some bonds are not meant to be caged by words or promises. They live in glances, in gestures, in the memory of a night when one life was given back its chance. When he swung back onto Ashfall's saddle, she felt both the ache of parting and the quiet fullness of knowing she would never again be truly alone. He raised one hand toward her, a simple farewell, but in it lay the weight of a vow. Then, with a sharp call, he urged the herd onward. The Mustangs moved as one, a living river of strength and fire, thundering past her yard and out across the endless prairie. Clara stood barefoot in the frost, her shawl drawn tight, her cheeks wet with tears. She watched until the last dust cloud vanished into the horizon. Then she turned back toward her cabin, her steps lighter, her chest fuller. The prairie still stretched vast and cold around her, but it no longer felt empty. She whispered into the dawn, as though to herself, as though to the memory of the man who had returned with a herd. Mercy always finds its way home. Closing reflection, direct to the viewer. Sometimes the world asks more than we think we can bear. Sometimes kindness feels like loss, like surrender. But kindness is a seed, and the prairie is wide, wider than fear, wider than shame. What you give away at dusk may thunder back to you at dawn, greater than you dared to dream. And in that returning, you find not just survival, but yourself.